A very, very warm welcome from me, first of all, Monica Boomduch, and as some of you will already know, I'm the founding director of a project called Insiders Outsiders, whose primary remit is to celebrate the hugely rich and pervasive contribution of those who found sanctuary here from Nazi Europe in the late 1930s, of course, in the run-up to the Second World War. But of course, as part of that, inevitably, it's also a tribute to people like Maurice Blik, who survived the worst that life can throw at anybody and managed to then come to this country, after the war. So it's my very, very special honor and privilege and pleasure to be chairing this event, which marks the appearance, pretty much hot off the press, I'm right, Maurice, aren't I, of a new memoir, an autobiography, an autobiography, as Maurice describes it, the art of survival. But as we'll see, it's very much more than the art of mere survival. Not, that sounds ridiculous, but I think you'll see what I mean when Maurice starts reading from the book. It's also, as I'm sure you're aware, planned for today to more or less coincide with Holocaust Memorial Day. And I don't want to kind of jump the gun or say anything that Maurice might not want me to say, but I think we have talked a little bit in advance of the session, and he, like I, feels very, very firmly that he should not in any way be categorized or labeled or pigeonholed as a Holocaust survivor first and foremost. He is an artist above all. And I think what he's going to be talking about today will make that very, very evident. So I think without further ado, I'll just ask you all to please remain muted and maybe turn off your cameras. I'm going to spotlight Maurice now so that you will see him center stage, which is only fitting. The plan of action, just to explain, is that he will be reading from the first 4 chapters of his new book. And then he and I will enter into, I think, a fairly informal and more or less impromptu conversation, but actually prompted by a series of PowerPoint images that I've compiled for the purpose. And we'll see how it goes. But of course, then it will be open for a Q&A, and I imagine there'll be many comments and questions people will have for Maurice. And if I could just remind you, the way to do it in the first instance is to write your questions. I know it's not ideal, but write your questions in the chat function. And if you could remember perhaps just to address them to me so that Maurice himself doesn't get too distracted, and indeed other people also don't get distracted. Yes, you can do that in the drop-down box, yes, when you using the chat function. So if you could remember to do that, I'd be grateful. And I, of course, will then moderate and field the questions, and we will hopefully have some lively discussion. Lovely. So I think without further ado, Maurice, over to you with great, great pleasure.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for making the observation about how I wish to be identified, and certainly first and foremost as a sculptor and somebody who happens to have gone through the experiences of the Holocaust. So my book is called The Art of Survival, and just a couple of words to put it into context. I've been a professional sculptor for about 30 odd years, and previous to that I taught at various levels, primary, secondary, and degree level and so on. I've been president of the Royal Society of British Sculptors, and as Monica's indicated, my early childhood years were spent in, well, at least 2 of them, near enough, were spent in Belsen. Can I just say a couple of words about the concept of the book? A very nice foreword by Matisha Kaplinski, who says, "His searing childhood experiences profoundly shaped the sculptor he was to become, renowned for works of majesty and life-affirming power." The book is described on the back as a first-hand narrative of the horrors of Bergen-Belsen seen through the eyes of a child and the remarkable life that followed. At the age of 5, Maurice Blik experienced some of the worst atrocities of World War II, a legacy that remains silent in him for almost 40 years, until it found a voice in the sculpture he began to create in the late 70s. As the story unfolds, so clues from his past emerge and connect with the artistic integrity. Often reticent when asked to talk about his work, Maurice Blik has tended to leave it to others to interpret his sculptures. In this autobiography, he takes conclusive ownership of the narrative, acknowledging links between his dramatic past and key bodies of his work. So that is the thrust of the book. As Monica said, I read from the first 4 chapters. Chapter 1, 1946, London. A pound of peacock feathers, a thimble full of moonlight, the footfall of a cat, an adder's tongue. I'm this foreign kid just getting to grips with the language, but I haven't got my tongue around the TH sound yet. I'm 7 years old on stage at Pinner Park Junior School, dressed as the Wicked Wizard, complete with pointed hat, bearing the moon and stars and crescent. People are laughing, not out loud comedic laughter, but mildly amused, behind their hands as if embarrassed. What's so funny, I wonder? I have no idea. Baffled, I carried on, casting my evil spell. The teachers must have had a really good sense of humor. Take this kid, clearly not a native English speaker, and with an obvious pronunciation problem, and put him center stage in a solo role to expose his inadequacy. Most amusing. That was the first of my 3 sensitively cast schoolboy acting roles. The second time, I played an evil doctor who sets about poisoning people. The third, even better. As the only Jewish kid in the school, I got the part of Shylock, the despised Jew in The Merchant of Venice, who eventually gets his comeuppance. And since I knew all about being despised in the real world, this play acting was uncomfortable ground. Perhaps the teachers had done educational psychology 101 and thought it best for me to confront my identity in public. Wrong. Born in Amsterdam, I had arrived at the school via the Nazi concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. Home was now suburban North London, Harrow and Wealdstone to be exact. Initially, what remained of my family and I were sent to Cheltenham, where my mother's sister lived. At that point, my English consisted solely of 201 Isle Road, Cheltenham, my aunt's address. Mother had drummed it into me and my sister Clara in case we got separated or mother didn't make it. I couldn't understand a word at school. The lessons were a complete mystery and there was no such thing as remedial teaching. The bullying from the other kids and the apparent lack of concern or help from the teachers left me feeling isolated. I was on my own and had to fend for myself. In the playground, the kids often formed a big circle around me and chanted and jeered. I had no idea what they were saying. I only knew that I was not one of them. But a spell in a Nazi concentration camp does wonders to inoculate you against insult and abuse. I had learned early on to keep my feelings under control. I had Irma Grazer to thank for that. 1943, Amsterdam. We lived in a first floor apartment above a grocery shop in Pretoriastraat in southeast Amsterdam. The modest early 20th century development was not far from the picturesque centre with its canals and 17th century architecture. Occasionally, we would ride the tram into the centrum, where there were lovely shops and treats, or take a short walk to the local park, Ooster Park. We made a handsome spectacle on these family occasions. My mother, Marie, would ensure that we were all suitably and well turned out. My straight dark hair would be slicked to one side like my father's, and I would be dressed in clean shirt and shorts. My sister, 2 years older than me, drew smiles from strangers with her cloud of white blonde curls, startling blue eyes, and pretty dresses. Mother was a tough cookie, proud and pragmatic. She was the sort of woman people didn't mess with. She was born in England, but had moved to Amsterdam at the age of 7 with her younger brother Bernie, her Dutch father Moses Sampson, and her English mother Amelia Polak. Moses died in 1938, aged 55, so her mother, Amelia, known to us as Omar, came to live with us. Omar was a very proper and forthright woman, British to the core. Her two eldest children, Esther and Alf, had remained living in England, being a good bit older than my mother. But despite these British connections, the only language that echoed around our home was Dutch. My father was born and raised a Dutchman. His three brothers and sister all lived in Amsterdam, making a family unit of 15 with their spouses and children. Half of them were murdered during the war. Father traveled around the country selling car parts. He was a man of impressive stature, standing 6'3" in his smart double-breasted suits and with sculpted cheekbones, which became even sharper when he drew on a cigar. He always came home with gifts for Clara and me, so his returns were loaded with excitement and expectation. It was a traditional home, with father out earning a living and mother keeping a kosher household. I was 4 years old when I was confronted by a German soldier in the shop below our apartment. We were sometimes sent by my parents to buy things. The soldier asked me where I lived. The German was close enough to Dutch for me to understand, and I pointed upstairs. He followed me back up the stairs, sheer narrow staircase, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his heavy boots making an ominous bang, bang, bang on the wooden steps. I was 4. I didn't know. 50 years on, I went back to show my daughter where I'd once lived. I thought I might go in, if possible, to see if I remembered how it looked. I peered apprehensively through the downstairs letterbox, and there was the steep, narrow staircase. It was a huge shock. 50 years vanished in an instant, and I was once again a young boy, guilty of letting this soldier into our home. I had no desire to go in there. Mother and Omar were sewing yellow stars onto our clothes. The stars had Yod written in big black letters on them, which my mother explained to me was because we were special people who had to be recognized. This made me feel quite proud, but it was not long afterwards that I began to sense it might not be a good thing. Our trips out were less frequent and more hurried. Eventually, we were all but confined to our apartment, only leaving it to purchase essential items. Food began to arrive via the cat basket. It was common practice for people living in apartments to lower their cats outside in a basket on a rope and haul it back up when the cat wanted to come in. As going out grew increasingly difficult, this became a discreet way to obtain food supplies. From our window, Clara and I could see into the street below. Occasionally we saw large numbers of soldiers on foot and big open cars with soldiers sat in the back. The ones in the cars dressed in long black leather coats looked very superior to the foot soldiers. People in civilian clothes would be hurried along the street. A woman running behind, shouting and crying, was shot. Now it was our turn. Removed from our home, we were herded into trucks and driven to a nearby theatre, together with hundreds of others, before being put on a train destined for Westerbork, where Omar had been dispatched ahead of us in April 1943. In August, we joined her. My mother, a few weeks pregnant, my father, Clara, and me, all of us interned in wooden huts and wooden bunk beds. Originally built by the Dutch government to house Jewish refugees from Germany, Westerbork in the north of Holland provided reasonable facilities. The huts had 3-tier bunks, basic bedding and washing facilities, and even some essential medical provision, which would prove vital for me. When the Nazis took it over, it became an interim camp in which people were held before being sent to other concentration camps. As the numbers grew way beyond anything Westerbork was originally intended for, so conditions deteriorated. From time to time, we received food parcels and censored letters from my Aunt Esther in the UK via the Red Cross. My mother wrote back, increasingly desperate in her responses, urging for her British documents to be sent. Although my mother and grandmother were British, according to Dutch law, their British nationality had been revoked through marriage. My parents therefore took the tough decision to divorce to help my mother regain her British status and to give us all a better chance of survival. The divorce was finalized before we arrived in Westerbork, but under the circumstances, getting her British identity papers proved impossible. One of the inmates at Westerbork was a surgeon, and one day after I complained of searing earache in both ears, he diagnosed mastocytitis, a life-threatening infection that affects the bone behind the ear. He operated on me, cutting away part of the bone on each side of my head. Afterwards, my head bandaged up, I had to lay on a tire inner tube so that my ears were suspended in the hole. He saved my life. In late 1943, Mother, Omar, Clara and I were moved on from Westerbork. Bergen-Belsen was to be our next destination. My father's fate and whereabouts were unknown to us. Bergen-Belsen. Halfway between Hamburg and Hanover in the north of Germany, Bergen-Belsen was intensely cold when we arrived during the winter of 1943. Popeye's job, so called because of the pipe he constantly sucked on, was to do the appel, the roll call. We would be summoned to stand outside in our meager clothing as he marched past counting us. The colder the weather, the more times he got it wrong and would have to start all over again. With a balaclava over my still bandaged head, I would stand with the hundreds of others, shivering in the freezing cold, suffering this eternal charade. The camp consisted of wooden huts with wooden three-tier bunks. Ours was euphemistically known as a star camp. My mother, an intelligent woman, managed to secure a top bunk for the three of us, which gave us a few advantages. We had better air circulation and avoided being covered in bodily fluids from people in the bunks above. We slept head to toe, Clara and me at one end, and my mother, her feet in our faces, at the other. I don't recall where Omar slept, or even whether she was in the same hut as us. The bases of the bunks were wooden slats, some of which were used to fuel the one stove in the barrack. But it wasn't long before available fuel for the stove was exhausted, since it was vital to leave enough slats to sleep on. Our bunk was our home, where we slept, ate, and congregated. In the morning, Clara and I would distract ourselves by getting rid of as many body lice as possible. The technique was simple. Put the lice on your thumbnail and snap it in two with the other one. A little jet of blood would spurt out, and we made a game of seeing how far we could make it go. Washing took place at a long communal trough fitted with several cold water taps along its length. There was one lavatory in the hut, but that quickly ceased to be usable. Wooden planks with holes cut out became the rudimentary and communal alternative. The trick in Belsen was to get enough food to stay alive. Served from a large cauldron, it consisted of a watery liquid with potato, turnip, and other vegetables floating in it. You would queue up with your metal dish to receive a portion. The further back in the line you were, the more chance you had of getting some of the good stuff, because the vegetables would sink to the bottom. But when you're starving, it's hard to be restrained. People wanted to get their ration as soon as possible, afraid that it might run out. Sometimes I was able to rejoin the queue and get a second helping, which I would take back to my mother, who was now nursing my baby sister Millie. She had appeared one night. I don't recall her arrival. I imagine my mother took herself off to a quiet corner to give birth. There must have been one or two midwives amongst the prisoners in the camp, and I like to think that she had the assistance of one of them, but I don't know, and it's not something I could ever talk to my mother about. The other way to obtain food was to grab it from dead people. On some days, we would be given a portion of bread, which would eke out for as long as possible. The safest way to do this was to sleep with it under your head, so that you had a chance of waking up if somebody tried to steal it. And when somebody died, the first thing to do was to check if they had any bread under their head. Everyone had cottoned on to this, so you had to be quick. Flower and I became good at spotting when someone was about to die. Belsen was never intended as an extermination camp, so there was no machinery in place for killing. It wasn't needed. Lack of food and sanitation, overcrowding, and the cruelty of the guards meant that typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation did the job perfectly well. Prisoners arriving from other camps were shocked at the horrors that met them, and Belsen has become a byword for some of the worst atrocities that human beings have ever inflicted on each other. Irma Geyser. 6 of you are going out, but only 5 of you are coming back. The dogs are hungry today. Irma Geyser was a beautiful young camp guard who had a habit of taking prisoners out to work and coming back with fewer. In she stormed, black polished jackboots, holstered pistols strapped around her waist, and her Alsatian dog leashed at her side. She saw me sitting on the floor next to someone's bunk, waiting for them to die so I could grab the food under their head and take it back to my family. She stared straight at me, thought for a moment, and then grinned. Slowly and deliberately, she reached into one of the deep pockets of her military jacket and took out a shiny red apple. She held it in her hand for a moment, admiring it, and then began crunching into it, her eyes fixed on me. Juices began trailing down the sides of her mouth. I knew she was taunting me. I kept still, not stirring to move or show any reaction. She ate the apple down to the core and then placed it carefully on the floor, unleashing the dog and setting it to guard the remains before walking off. Dog and I faced each other as it sat on its back legs with the core between its front legs, snarling and baring its teeth. I remained stock still, trying to show no fear. I knew that if I ran or tried to grab the core, it would tear me apart. We sat like that for I don't know how long until she came back. Amused to see that I hadn't tried to make a grab for the apple core, she stomped on it and ground the remains into the bare wooden floorboards until there was nothing left even to scrape off. When putting the dog back on its leash, she paced out of the hut, looking pleased with her lesson. This was probably a minor episode in her daily repertoire of sadism, but I like to think that I thwarted her expectations of me. She didn't come back to a 5-year-old bloodied and mauled by the dog's jaws. She found me expressionless and calm, exactly as she'd left me. In my own way, I had stood up to her. I felt the victory was mine. I'll stop there, Monica.
Thank you so much, Maurice. I think we all need to probably just take pause for a little, don't we, to begin to absorb what you've been reading out to us. How would you like to proceed? I think perhaps since you haven't talked about your evolution, your progress, you know, your life story as a sculptor, shall we move on to the images straight away and then perhaps, yes, talk about the work itself, then come back? Yes, I think that's probably the way to do it. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is,
sorry, I was going to say perhaps I'd say a few words about the images you throw up.
yes, no, absolutely. Let's do that, because I'm aware that some of you may not be aware of Maurice's work in any great detail, or perhaps even at all, and are curious to see what the work actually looks like. Although, of course, you do get a tantalizing and quite vivid glance, a sort of glimpse in the background there of Maurice's screen. So let me screen share. Okay. I'll go full screen. Good. All right, I take it everybody can see all right. This, of course, is the book itself, a really beautifully produced publication, and we'll say more about how you can get hold of it later on. Let's start with some of your earliest work. Tell us, however you see fit, how it happened, what these works signify.
Right. Well, as I say, the book is really making the connections between my past experiences and the sculpture I went on much later, obviously, to produce. And these are two of an example of a great many horses' heads I made, which came about through a pure chance meeting, which I don't think I want to reveal at this point. But the connection was made later on when I did have some psychotherapy many years later. The connection was made between making these horses' heads and an experience I had, which was a very life-affirming experience. I'm sorry to remain so mysterious about it, but I don't particularly want to give away the book at this point.
Indeed, and tell us a little about this.
Right, well, you just heard me talk about Irma Grese and her vicious dog, her guard dog, and again, what must it be, about 15 years ago or something, I can't remember the exact date, I was offered a solo show in the West End, and for lots of emotional reasons, I thought I need to face this experience and lay the ghost to rest, as it were. And this was a maquette, for people who are not familiar with sculptural terms. Sculptors call scale models, if you like, prototype models, whatever you want to call them, maquettes. Don't ask me why, but that's the term that's given. So this was a little maquette I made for eventually a larger piece that formed part of an exhibition I had. This piece, well, you can see the title, it's called Touching Victory. It's a more recent piece, and well, it's 2.5 meters tall, and it's one of the pieces I made. I need to just say this, that all the work I've made, apart from the thing you saw of the dog, all the work I've made has been how can I put it? It's not conscious attempt to illustrate anything. The connections have come much later. So when I was making these pieces, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is about whatever it is, this is obviously a sort of aspiring piece, but it's never an attempt to illustrate an event or a particular, time at all. And the relationship between that and the experience is really, in the end, what the book's talking about, because it's the last 3 years when I started making it. I'm now 82, so a good bit of time has gone by before I started taking, as it were, ownership of these connections. As I read right at the beginning, the little preface to the book makes that point, that this was an unconscious or subconscious motive to make stuff. And of course, people always had their ideas about what it represented and what it meant. And I've been asked lots of times, what's your inspiration? What inspires you? And I've never really answered it, partly because to sort of try maybe to, as it were, analyze my own feelings about it would have been, I suspected, always very painful. And in fact, writing the book was, quite a painful experience in many ways, but I thought it was probably time to take ownership of that narrative, as they say, and make those things, in my interpretation, make those things clear to me. This is another piece. It's called Second Breath, as you can see, and it's, I suppose, fairly self-evident that this is what second breath, second chance of life, a second, go at it. It's been a very, I must say, admired piece and very popular in the sense that it was used in a new hospital building in the States, a new Alexander Chandler Hospital, Albert Chandler Hospital in Kentucky, and it was commissioned by the whatever the head executive of the hospital to stand outside the new building, and he told a very heartwarming story about a mother who had come in with her little child, I don't know how old, a little baby anyhow, it was touch and go whether this child was going to make it. And Dr. Cass sent me a thing saying she came in every day and came to the sculpture and said, I hope my child makes it. And eventually the child did. And it's very touching to have that kind of feedback from somebody. I don't know the woman, obviously, and it was very, very moving to get that story from the doctor who was there. So yeah, people find it a very inspiring piece, and I'm very pleased about that, because I think the whole thrust of my work is life affirming, inspiring, aspiring. That's really what it's about. This was a piece, this was commissioned for Docklands when it was developed, and I'm sure people are familiar with that huge initiative from the government of developing an area which had been very industrial powerhouse, London Docklands, and a lot of it had kind of fallen by the wayside because of various factors and technology advancing and so on. Anyway, I was asked to make a piece that was a landmark piece for a development there, and the brief was that it wanted to reflect on the history of the Docklands. So this piece depicts a very powerful male figure, sort of symbolizing the physical energy and power of the dockers, literally, who worked there with their sweat of their brow, as it were, and the future, which is symbolized by this ethereal female form. And they come together and they embrace each other. So that is the theme for that. And it was well received. This piece stands about nearly 5 meters high. So it's quite an imposing piece. Since, I have to say, if you go to Docklands and look for it, it's not there anymore, because this was 92, so it's a good while ago now, and that whole area has been redeveloped, so the sculpture is no longer there. So please don't go and look for it, because you won't find it there. But this is a small, quite a small piece. It stands, I think, 40 centimeters high, something like that. It's called Source, and it's fairly self-evident, I suppose, that you know, what's the source of the human race, and you know, where does it come from? So I don't need to explain that, I'm sure. All these pieces you see are bronze, modeled in clay first, and then molded and cast, and lost wax method. This is Release. It's from a series of works which I call the shadow pieces, and it's about pieces emerging from their shadows, psychological shadows, as well as, in a way, literal from the point of view there. They were, you know, they go back a year or two. And writing this book, I've discovered that my work falls into various categories, and one of them we call shadow pieces, where there are quite a lot of them figures struggling out of the past, if you like. Again, I keep emphasizing this was all unconsciously done. The connections have come much, much, much later. So this is a bronze. It stands, what's 60 centimeters, something like that. Sorry, yeah, next. The one on the left, called Early Woman, was in fact one of the very first pieces I made in this sort of category, in these shadow figures, of a female figure, as you can see, stepping out of her shadow of her past. And the one on the right, more articulated and more dynamic, I suppose, the same concept. I think when artists get into a kind of mindset, they tend to, well, as far as I'm aware, they tend to just go on and on and on, developing it and developing it and developing it, until at last you come to the end of that and then move into another area, if you like. And again, the book does reveal that process. This is called Triandus, and it's three figures meeting. They're identical figures, and this is just the enjoyment of the visual quality of what's happening. You probably recognize it as a small version of Second Breath, which is what they are, and I just like the idea of putting them together, purely visual interest, really. Now that's, again, the height of that is about 35 centimeters or something like that, between 30 and 35, I think 33, I seem to remember. So that, again, that's a bronze. And one can read a lot into it, these three figures coming together and making a dance or whatever. This is why I've been reluctant to talk about my work, because you start getting into all sorts of interpretations. And that's where, again, you know, this book has been such a valuable experience for me, anyhow. This was commissioned by a private individual, Sir Peter Michael, who had seen, if you can think back 2 or 3 slides, the Renaissance in Docklands, and he loves sculpture, and he said to me, "Yes, I like that piece. Can you make me something?" I said, "Yeah, of course. What's the budget?" "Oh, no, there's no budget." "Well, what is it you want? Do you want to see a maquette, scale model?" No, you just make it. Whatever you want to make. And that, in a way, is a very tall order when there's absolutely no sort of limitation, no criteria. You just do what you want to do. And so I made this, and this is about, what is it, 7 meters wide. So it's a big piece. I made it, I cast it, I delivered it to site, installed it, and there was no how you're getting on or whatever from this Sir Peter. And eventually it was installed on the site. He said, choose your site. It's got lots of sort of space. And he had a look at it when it was installed. And he said, yeah, I like that. And that was it. But yeah, he's obviously a man of few words.
Explain time.
The ideal patron. Yes, if only all commissions could be that straightforward. Let's continue.
Sorry, can we go back to the
Yes, of course.
Yeah, Deborah, of course, has reminded me what the theme of this was, which was not set by him, it was by me. And it's called At First Light, well, it says that under there. And the idea is as the sun comes up, it penetrates the space between the two heads that are about to embrace. They don't touch, you can't see it on that photograph, but there's a space of, well, I don't know, 15, 20 centimeters between the two heads. And he's about to embrace the female. She's looking the other way. And as the sun comes up, it shines between the two. So there's a moment of, I suppose you'd call it ecstasy, I don't know. So that's the theme of that. Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for reminding me. Right, yes. About 3 years ago, I started developing by, again, pure chance. Chance, you know, accidents and chance are wonderful things if you take advantage of them, as it were. And yeah, as I say, I make everything in clay and it's modeled up, and then the process is it gets cast and goes to bronze. And I keep my clay in a very large bin, and it gets used and reused and reused. And they say that the more you use clay and reuse it, the better it gets. But anyhow, there's probably, I don't know what it weighs, about a ton or so of clay in this bin. So I dig it out and then I use it to model up. And I've always modeled in a very traditional way. You build an armature, which is a structure to hold the clay, because obviously there's a limit to how much clay will support itself. And one day I'm digging some clay out to use, and I realized that the tub was full of clay lumps and bits have been chopped up, and because you have to keep it damp, so you have to chop it up and damp it and all that. And I noticed some interesting structures, so I cast a bit of it. I just poured a bit of plaster into an area and pulled it off, and this was the great reveal. When I pulled the plaster out, it had all sorts of nooks and crannies and hollows and lumps, and I thought that this is so exciting. I mean, you can't invent this stuff. And so that got me off on a whole journey of exploring this idea, still wanting to make figurative work, but trying to do it this way. And for the last 3, maybe 4 years, I've been doing sculpture this way, and I refer to this era of making sculptures, digging deep. And in my book, I explore that in a kind of psychological way as well. So this is one of the very latest pieces, and the piece that's sitting up behind my head is one of those. It's that little one is called Striding, and to my mind, they're full of dynamic qualities that I couldn't invent if I do it making them the conventional way at all. And that one's called, well, you can see Succeeding. So that's about 40, 50 centimeters high, I suppose, that sort of size. And I've made some very large ones in this way as well. This is a sort of, well, this was done in 2017, as you can see. Obviously, it was modelled a bit before that. It was installed then. This was a commission I got from evacuees reunion association. They're what they say, they're people that were evacuated during the Second World War. They're now obviously getting on in their 80s, 90s. And they wanted a memorial to commemorate the evacuation. There is nothing in the country to, there it is, in situ. So because of the time frame that it referred to, it really resonated with me. Not that I was an evacuee, but I was also, you know, taken out of my home and went to live somewhere, in my case, not very friendly. And some of the evacuees did have a bit of a nasty time and used as basically as unpaid labourers on farms and so on. Anyhow, I made this for the Evacuees Reunion Association, and it was installed at the National Memorial Arboretum up in Staffordshire, which is a site for civil and military war memorials. So it's a beautiful site, and there's a lot of memorials up there, and some really great stuff. So that was installed there. The piece is about 16 feet, 5 meters long. And although the figures themselves are half life size, and again, Deborah was instrumental in deciding what sort of size it would be. And that's the fact that they're half life size in that landscape makes them feel even more bewildered and vulnerable and lost. So yeah, that was installed in 2017, 28, yeah.
And the title came from the title was driven by one of the evacuees, wasn't it?
Yeah,
the title, one of
yeah, sorry, again, Deborah leaps to the remind me that it's called Every Which Way. And the reason for that is I presented a maquette. You're now all familiar with what a maquette is. I presented the maquette, which was, it's about a meter long, something like that. So there were tiny little figures. And the panel looked at this, and I explained my thinking behind it, which, you know, is about trying to create this atmosphere of bewilderment and lost and kids not knowing where they were going, which is true, and all the rest of it. And one of the panels said, "You've got it exactly. We were going every which way." And I thought, what a brilliant title. So there it is. That's the title, Every Which Way, the National Memorial to the Evacuees. They're very happy with it. So this, what you see now, this image you see now, is a very, very recent piece. In fact, it's still at the foundry. This is again a maquette, and I was in the final four listed for a memorial to this lady, Alfra Ben, who was 17th century writer, the first writer in this country, the first female writer to earn her living as a writer. And Canterbury Commemorative Society want to put up a memorial to her. And they chose this as one of the 4 finalists. I've no idea what the other 3 look like. And this, the rationale behind this is that it's not about what this lady looked like, which is what you you often get with sculptures of female people, you know, their sort of dress of the period they live in and what they look like and so on. And I wanted to downplay that whole experience of, you know, women are judged by the way they look and how they dress and all the rest of it. So the emphasis here is on what Alfred did, which is write books, not what she looked like or what period of the history she comes from. So this is part of my new approach to digging deep into the meaning of these things rather than the look of them. And I'm really pleased that this is in the final 4 of over 50 people that applied for this commission. So the decision will be made in July, and it'd be wonderful if I get the job.
Lovely. That seems a very apposite place at which to end. I think, Maurice, let me stop screen sharing. Yes, and let's start some dialogue going. That was beautifully illuminating and insightful. Thank you so much. And I think a wonderful compliment, I'm sure you'll all agree, to the reading from your text. Now, let me just check if there are any questions coming in. Now is your chance, everybody. I have obviously my own questions and things I'd like to discuss with Maurice, but please do start typing your thoughts and questions in while you have the chance. Okay, well, I think you can all see. Yes, thanks. Profoundly moved, obviously, it goes without saying. Let me perhaps start with some quite specific things. Yes, okay, so at least one question focusing on the work itself. Maurice, the question of titles, I mean, clearly they come, as they always do with works of art, they come after the work is a fait accompli, but is it you who come up with the titles? Is it Deborah? Is it somebody else? Because, you know, clearly they are very leading titles, aren't they? Which actually ties in with the comment that's just come through, but tell us a little bit about that.
Before I met Deborah, I did the titles. Now you can guess who does them, by and large.
But they tend to be of a similar kind, am I right? They are kind of universal, but clearly born out of very personal experiences.
We're talking about the titles of the sculpture. They emerge very often. You know, I've been thinking. I'll do it the other way around. I don't have a title in mind and then make a sculpture. What happens, as you probably figured out by now, I work quite intuitively. I make the sculpture, you know, and then what emerges often suggests a title, which Deborah then says yes or no to, but mainly she says that should be called Succeeding or whatever. And that, I mean, it's not totally arbitrary, obviously, I'm making light of it, but there is, the sculpture itself suggests titles, and Deborah's brilliant at getting that. I'm not very good at it, so it's, you know, wonderful that she's able to see what the sculpture's saying and so on. So the titles come when the piece has been made, and they are certainly the sculpture I refer to as a sort of digging deep area. It's all about what it feels like, not what it looks like. They're not illustrations of running or jumping or whatever. They're a sense of what it feels like to do that. It's, you know, about feeling, not about illustration.
I think that's very evident, and I did ask you, didn't I, just a few days ago, whether you ever did drawing from life or indeed preparatory sketches, and, you know, entirely as I expected, you said, well, actually no, because that's not really what your work is about. Can I also ask you, were you ever at all remotely tempted by complete abstraction? Again, I think I probably know the answer to that, but did your work ever veer in that direction?
By abstraction?
Abstraction, yeah.
I had a little toy with it when I was when I was young and foolish. No, you know, when I was 18, 19, 20, I did attempt a couple of little, not so much little, but a couple of abstract pieces, but it's not my thing. And it takes a little while to realize what you're what you really enjoy and what you're good at, in the sense that, you know, what makes you tick. So I've abandoned any idea of abstraction. You know, I don't get involved with it. It's not my thing. So yeah.
Indeed. Okay, so you've got some questions coming in now. It always sort of increase in number just as time is beginning to run out. But let's see. Yes, sorry, I can't see the name of the question here, but wondering, for every piece that you make and indeed display in public, are there other pieces you destroy or that remain entirely private, not on view to anybody else?
Yes is a short answer to that. I've several times worked on a piece even for weeks, months, and it never goes right, and then eventually you say it's not going to happen, and it goes back in the clay bin. So yes is an answer to that.
There's a question about the sculpture next to you. I think you did talk about that. It's called Striding, am I right? This is one of your recent work. So that's a quick answer to that question.
Yes.
Right, a question here. Lots of lovely appreciative words coming in, as you might expect. Excellent and emotive reading of an early life trauma. Has Maurice met up with the art and sculpture of other Holocaust survivors, like the late Naomi Blake? And I don't know whether we have Naomi's daughter in the audience, Anita, and whether you might like to chip in. She was certainly planning to come, but do you? I mean, yes, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I have met her, I don't know, not very many times, but I know of her. I've met her, I've seen her work, and she made some very eloquent pieces. A Tree of Knowledge, I think, was one of her pieces. It's very different to work I do, but
you had an exhibition with Naomi here.
Yeah, yes,
oh, right,
very
okay.
yeah, yes. Deborah runs a gallery here, Sculpt Gallery, and we showed together. Naomi and I showed together, and I didn't. You say she's not around anymore?
She died a few years ago now. Yeah.
I didn't know. Yeah.
Mm.
Yes, she was, another survivor, as they say, and I suppose expressed her thoughts in her way.
A much more female way.
Mm.
Possibly, but and actually with a more abstracted sort of approach to the human form. But yes, but a similarly universalizing impulse that they want, she wanted to transmute her experiences into something that could speak to everyone, which I'm sure is what you two aim for. Absolutely. On the question of, other artists, as an art historian, I'm naturally curious to know, what you see as your artistic sources. I mean, Rodin is somebody who immediately comes to mind. You mentioned him in your text. Who else might you care to mention?
Yes, I've had the Rodin connection many times.
Yeah.
I think it's superficial connection, in the sense that what he was about is not what I'm about. And certainly the last, whatever it is, 3-4 years, with this work that I'm doing and what I call the digging deep phase, I don't know if you would connect. I mean, the piece I've got behind my head there, would you connect that with Rodin? I'm not sure you would. But all sculptors are after the same thing in the end. It's forms in space, dynamic, moving, or the other sort of approach is like the Egyptian sculptures that are timeless and just sit there forever. Mine are dynamic in the sense that they're forms moving through space rather than existing not simply in a derogatory sense, but in a very clear and simple concept that these forms are static and live in space, whereas mine, I hope, move through that. Perhaps nearer to the concept of dance, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, obviously, Rodin was a great sculptor, no question. But I've never been tempted to sit on his shoulders or, you know, try and imitate or whatever his work. I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't in a way dare to do that, because that would be such a superficial approach. And like, you know, my influences are certainly not there.
There's a comment about so many of your figures seeming to strive upwards, which I'm sure everybody else has picked up on as well. Do I dare suggest that this is a sign of hope? But also on the back of that, I'm very struck, Maurice, that they are intensely physical. They're, you know, made of clay. What could be more earthy than that? They are firmly rooted, you know, literally the feet are on the ground, and yet there is this sort of tremendous sense of movement and indeed upward thrust, if you like. So I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, I think what I've tried to do is make my work inspirational, aspiring, and you know, celebrating life. So yeah, that's the basic thrust behind it. It's you know, human beings celebrating, aspiring, looking to the future, and that's what it's about, and that's why, in a way, this direction I'm going now has more chance of that in a way than the previous work, because it's not again, it's the sensation that they give off rather than what they look like. It seems maybe an odd thing to say because it's a visual form, but I hope when people see the work, they get a sense and the feeling from it, yeah, they move up, they move along.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time and thinking we should probably begin to round off rather reluctantly, I have to say. But there's another question that's come in. I can only imagine that you feel a great sense of accomplishment from your finished pieces, but do they bring you feelings, bring you feelings, a word that I can't quite decipher there, of happiness when you look back at them, or do they in some part, some measure, act as a painful reminder of your past life experiences? I guess that might also tie in with the actual act, the process of writing this book, both cathartic and yet, I mean, perhaps you'd like to say something about how you feel now that the book has been written and is out there in the world.
The book has been, as I think I said earlier, it's been quite hard in many ways and quite painful, because obviously, you know, I haven't gone around the world talking about my past. I'm not inclined to do that. But writing the book, I've been compelled really to you know, revisit the past, and there's some very, as you can imagine, some very painful periods in there. So the book has been, I suppose, the exercise of trying to make connections. You know, a lot of artists are of the opinion that they don't want to know what drives their work. Famously, people like, you know, big names like Henry Moore was never interested. He didn't want to know where his sources came from, because a lot of artists believe if you know that, it takes away the initiative to make the work. And having written the book and made those connections, I'm now completely of the opposite opinion. I think the more you know about what the sources are, what the inspiration is, if you like, where these ideas come from, the more you're able to carry on working, because there is a sort of intrinsic belief in what you're doing. externalizing these feelings, if you like, which are from a source which is completely individual and completely genuine, which is why, in a way, when you asked a bit earlier on about, being inspired, if you like, by Rodin, well, I'm not Rodin, and therefore, if I were to take from that source or any other source, if you like, that would be not my experience. I mean, there are formal things, obviously, but apart from that, the formal stuff is just the nuts and bolts. It's what you do with them that matters. And so now I've written this and I've explored and made connections. I feel very secure in what I'm doing.
Is there more writing in you, do you think, or do you feel now it's time to get back to the sculpture?
Well, it's happening all the time, even writing the book and this commission that has just come about. Well, I'm in the final for it. But yeah, I mean, all the time I've been writing the book, I've been working on making sculpture as well. So, it does keep one quite busy one way and another.
I'm very struck, if you just dwell on the way you've presented your story in the book. And I wonder if I might ask you about the role of humor. There is an almost devastating, dark, almost dry humor in much of what you write about the most appalling of experiences. Was that, I mean, I suspect you're like that in everyday life as well. I don't know you well enough to be sure of that. But is that something you were conscious of in the writing of your past?
Dry humor, I wasn't really...
I think most people, it's certainly something that leapt out at me, and also, kind of ability to step back almost dispassionately. But it's the humor that struck me in particular. I mean, it's devastating in context, of course.
I wasn't really conscious of it.
No, I wondered.
What can I say? I'm not going to cry about it. That's So, what can I say? You deal with it. It's not. It hasn't been. That's really where I've come in, as it were. I'm anxious not to be defined as Holocaust survivor. Period. That's it. Nothing more. And I have to tell you a little story. I've told it before, but I was in the what's it called, the Imperial War Museum one time a few years ago with a friend who was doing some research there, and I was sitting in the coffee shop, while she was busy doing stuff, and a couple of tables across from me was a chap sitting there, summertime, he had short sleeve shirt on, and I saw on his arm, the numbers from Auschwitz, obviously. And I looked at it. He saw me looking at it, at his arm, and not a word was said. And he came over to my table, took a address card out of his pocket, of his wallet, and gave it to me, and then went back and sat down. And I looked at it, and it gave his name, and underneath it said Auschwitz survivor. And it just hit me that in a way is the last thing I want to be known as, and it just not where I start and finish my life. I've had a good few years since Belsen, and I hope I've made for want of a better word, a contribution to life, and I don't want to just hark back constantly on all the awful things that happened. Yes, they happened, and I recognise, obviously, that these were very, very profound things, and fundamentally gave me a view of the world at that age. But I don't want to dwell on it constantly. Yes, it has an effect. That's, again, that's obvious from what I've written and obvious to anybody. But that's not it. It doesn't stop there. You know, my life hasn't stopped when I was liberated from Belsen. It's gone on, and I hopefully made a contribution and done something meaningful with my life. I hope I've still got a bit more to go and I can carry on doing it. So, yeah.
Well, that seems a wonderfully, sort of a powerful and important place to stop. We could carry on. It's a big topic, that not for tonight. Thank you very much, Maurice. That was truly wonderful. I'd like to just end with a few practical issues, if I may. One is that the book is available to everybody who's attended this event at a special discount. And what I'm going to do either this evening or tomorrow morning is to send everybody an email giving the details of how to use the discount code on both the publisher's website and Maurice's own website, which incidentally I would very much encourage you all to look at for a broader sense of his artistic output. Also worth mentioning, of course, the fact that you can, am I right, Maurice, you can actually make an appointment, or can you just turn up to visit the sculpture gallery? Is it open on a regular basis, or how does it work if people want to come and see the work in the flesh, as it were?
Yes, sorry, I'm just checking how
by appointment.
By appointment. I'll give everybody the link also to the yes, in fact the website includes a link to the gallery itself, because of course there is absolutely no substitute for seeing the real thing in 3 dimensions. And also I'd like to mention, sorry Maurice, go on.
Clarify on that as well. As Deborah said, from her point of view, that you should really make an appointment. But until the 10th, is it, of February, so this week and next week, I'm showing some work at my gallery in London. It's called Bowman Sculpture, and it's in Duke Street, St James, just literally opposite the Royal Academy, that street, just off Piccadilly. So Bowman Sculpture is showing my work until the 10th of, is it the end of that week? 10th of
Very good. I'll make sure I'll find the link and I'll add that as well to the email. The other thing I'd like to mention, which hasn't been mentioned yet, that just a few years back, Maurice was, I was going to say part of, more than that, he was the focus of the subject of a wonderful documentary called Hollow Dog, which can be viewed online by special permission of the director, for which many thanks. I'll provide the link to that as well. Last but not least, I'd like to say that the event has been recorded, and within a few days or so, the recording will be available on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. So for those of you who'd like to listen again, tell your friends, whatever, it will be available for the foreseeable future. We've got lots of lovely positive comments coming back. Maybe I'll send you the chat, Maurice, so you can look in your own time. And if I may just also end, well, first of all, a huge thank you to Maurice and indeed to Deborah lurking in the background, and to everybody attending. But also I'd like to mention 2 other events which may be of interest to those attending today. One is actually just in 2 days' time, very, very different and yet part and parcel of the bigger story of which Maurice's life and work is definitely part. And that's an event organized by the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees, but actually chaired by myself, in conversation and in response to a presentation by the grandson of John Hartfield, the hugely important pioneering figure in political photomontage and ardent anti-fascist, a wonderful individual with a huge legacy. So John Hartfield Jr. will be talking on Wednesday at 6 o'clock, I think it is. So that's also on the AJR website and the Insiders Outsiders website in the What's On section. And also, just very lastly, picking up on that question of clay and the sort of uses and the significance, possibly symbolic as well as practical, of clay. On the 28th of February, there's going to be a talk by a ceramic artist who makes vessels. So not figures, but called David Jones, who is the son of a refugee from Nazism. And he'll be in conversation with Julia Weiner, who many of you will know, about the way that he uses clay in order to grapple with his experiences of being a second generation Holocaust survivor, as indeed he calls himself, possibly slightly contentiously, but that again is a huge subject for another day. So I think enough already, as they say, the night is drawing on. Maurice, thank you once again very, very much. I wish you well, and I hope we'll keep in touch. And thank you everyone for being part of the audience. All the very best and good night.
Okay.